Hey, welcome to Young Heretics. My name is Spencer. This is my podcast, which feels a little bit insane to say. It's surreal. I think we announced maybe 2 months ago that I was going to do this show. And since then, obviously, coronavirus has thrown this enormous wrench into everything that everybody is doing, including this. So that meant this took a little bit longer to get to you than we thought it would. But also, we just wanted to make sure that it looks and sounds as good as it possibly can before we present it to you. And I have this incredible team of people actually that's working on making that happen. So we'll thank them in due course because I'm profoundly grateful to them. And I'm also really grateful to you. Thanks for being here. Thank you for watching this first episode of the show or listening to it, if you are listening to it. And yeah, it's great to have you here on this journey, which we're starting. I'm going to spend a little bit of time in this first episode talking about what that journey is, why we're here, what we're doing, just to get both you and me used to Young Heretics as a podcast. First things first, I'm Spencer. If you don't know me already, my name is Spencer Klavan. You may have found me through Twitter or maybe my dad's show, which is the Andrew Klavan Show. Maybe you've just stumbled upon this show sort of without thinking about it. Great. I'm Spencer. I'm an editor. I'm a writer. I'm a literary scholar. I work at the Claremont Institute, which is a really fantastic think tank out here in California. We'll get to talking about them in a little bit as well. But this is really something that I'm doing kind of on the side as like a passion project. Because before I came out here to work in California, I did a PhD in classics, which is ancient Greek and Latin literature back in Oxford in the UK. And that's really maybe my deepest love is classics, classical literature, and Western literature and culture more generally, which is what this show is about. The point of Young Heretics is to bring you culture without the culture wars. And probably anybody who's listening to my voice right now knows what I mean when I say the culture wars, right? I mean, mostly I'm talking about the progressive slide into insanity on the part of our academies of higher education. I promise that I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time ranting about that, but I'll just give you a few examples if you don't already know what I mean, right? So in 2016, so 4 years ago now, students at Yale, which is my alma mater, is where I went to undergraduate, students at Yale petitioned to decolonize the English major, which basically meant removing all the dead white men. And in 2017, they basically granted this request. I mean, there's some nuance to this story, but essentially they've reworked the English major at Yale. One consequence of which is that you can graduate as an English major from one of ostensibly the greatest universities in the country without ever having read William Shakespeare. In 2020, just this year, they did something, they're talking about doing something kind of similar at Oxford, where they're worried that requiring Homer for a classics degree encourages inequality, because people, maybe rich kids, have been to schools where you read Homer and they come in with kind of a leg up. And so they're thinking about maybe making Homer optional for classics as well. I don't know what the future of that petition is going to be, but I bring it up as another example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And really, I only have one thing to say about all of that stuff, all the sort of social justice warrior, race theory, queer theory, feminist theory, Western culture is racist, all of that. The only thing I have to say to you about it is that it's crap, right? It's crap. We all know it's crap. We don't even have to spend time arguing about whether it's crap, explaining why it's crap. Because if we do, we get caught in this trap, right? And this happens all the time to people that love Western literature and Western culture and want to talk about it. We get so hung up on just defending it against the culture war crazies that we never actually spend time enjoying the literature itself. We're always arguing about why the literature isn't racist, or why it's not homophobic, or why it's not anti-feminist or whatever, or why it's okay to study it, even if there are complications and stuff. We spend so much time arguing about that we barely spend any time talking about actual literature, the actual literature that we're trying to defend and read. And that's just another version of this trap, right? That's just letting the culture wars win. So I know that those fights are important to fight. I know that we have to have these conversations about how we take back the academy, how we take back the culture. But those fights are going to be there for a while. And for this show, we're going to leave them outside the door. We're just going to check all of that. We're not going to argue about identity politics, except to say that it's nonsense. We're not going to rant against the academy as much as we might like to. But we're just going to talk together about Western culture. Because really what this is, right, it's like the academies of higher learning and the professors at those academies are standing in front of this vault, right? This vast treasure vault. And in the vault, there's gems and gold and jewels piled up high to the ceiling. And there's tables with rich food just laid on fine china. And there's all this fabulous wealth for free. That's what Western culture is like. That's what this huge wealth of literature and poetry and philosophy and history that comes down to us in the West, that's what it is. It's this enormous treasure trove. And the people that run our universities, they're standing in front of that treasure trove with the key, right? They're there to usher you into that tradition. And more, they're just saying, you know what, you don't need this key. You don't need to go inside. It takes work, and that's unfair. And maybe there's some racist or homophobic stuff in this vault, and you don't really have to go inside. And it's like, don't go inside. These people have lost their minds, right? I mean, increasingly, this is an actual kind of mania. And what I want to do, I just want to stop freaking out about that and just go inside the vault and just pick up treasures every week. That's what we're going to do. We'll talk about a new work of Western culture. I'll have guests on to talk about things that they particularly love or are passionate about. And we'll just spend a little time kind of enjoying that heritage of the West. The first thing that we're going to start with for this first episode is Homer. And we're going to start with that for a number of reasons. First of all, Homer is an ancient Greek poet. That's kind of my area of particular expertise and specialty. But also, Homer is really, in many ways, where it all begins, right? I mean, there is a huge tradition of literature in the Hebrew Bible, which dates back even earlier than Homer, and we will talk about that actually probably next week. But for the kind of Greco-Roman side of antiquity, Homer is really the oldest complete poet that we have remaining. He composed, and we'll get to that, he composed two massive epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And we're going to talk mainly about the Iliad today and just sort of read a little bit of the Iliad and kind of enjoy it. But first, who is Homer, right? Let's chat a little bit about who Homer was and why we have these poems that we think are by him. So the answer to that question is actually way more complicated than you might like it to be. If you haven't already encountered this problem, it's sometimes called the Homeric question. Homer, if he existed as an individual person, existed so very long ago that we're just not quite sure about who he was. It's somewhere around the 7th or 8th century BC. So 700s BC. There come into being these poems. And we have these kind of distant records in history of a group of people called the Homeridae, who lived on the island of Chios, which is just off of Asia Minor, now Turkey. And this was a clan of people who claimed to be descended from a guy named Homer. And clearly, we don't know a ton about these people, but clearly they were part of this tradition of reciting poetry, of sort of standing around together in large groups or in concert halls, performance spaces, and reciting poetry. This kind of it was the entertainment, right? Along with things like sports. This was the way that people would gather together and entertain one another and pass on stories and pass on wisdom and all this stuff. There was this tradition of song. It's not written. This is kind of an important thing, right? It's not written down at this point. It's a tradition of bards, singers, memorizing this work. And somewhere along the line in that tradition, we get these two massive poems, way, way longer than probably the other stuff that was being recited. The Iliad is 15,693 lines long, and the Odyssey is 12,110 lines long. They're divided up into books now, but they are these kind of just giant, continuous epics that were recited. And more as this tradition caught on in mainland Greece, they became kind of cultural touchstones. People would gather to hear them recited, and it became almost like, it's like a combination of Shakespeare and the Bible, right? If you put those two things together, they have this immense cultural weight. People learn them in school, people memorize them, people quote them at each other, use them to have philosophical arguments. It's kind of like this repository of cultural wisdom that gets passed down in this oral tradition and then eventually written down. And by the time we get to, say, the 5th century BC in Athens, which is kind of the high classical period, that is where a lot of the stuff that you hear about in Greece comes from. By the time you get there, these are these already canonical texts. And so they stand really at the wellspring of all literature. And it's why it's so ridiculous to say you don't need to read Homer to learn classics, right? There is no classics. There is no classical literature without Homer. You can't not do it. It's just insane, right? To think that you can kind of say, well, this is optional. This is some sort of peripheral thing. It's not peripheral. It ain't peripheral to anything, right? It's not even peripheral to sort of non-literary stuff. I mean, we'll eventually get to sort of why the influence that literature has on the rest of the world. But you certainly cannot understand Western literature without digging deep into this sort of original wellspring of wisdom and poetry, which are the Iliad and the Odyssey, written composed probably by somebody who brought together a bunch of pre-existing material. That's kind of who I think Homer was, somebody that brought together all this pre-existing stuff. But just to give you an idea, right, Aeschylus, the one of the great Greek tragedians, the kind of earliest writer of Greek tragedies, was rumored to have said that all of his plays were just slices from the banquet of Homer. So that's what we're dealing with here, right? We're dealing with a self-conscious literary tradition that draws stuff out of these massive original texts. Like I say, we're not going to talk too much about the Odyssey today. The Odyssey is about a long journey home on the part of Odysseus from the Trojan War. So it actually takes place after the Iliad, because the Iliad is about the Trojan War. But let's just briefly, for those who don't know, summarize the basic outlines of the plot of the Iliad. So, the story of the Trojan War, there is this unspeakably hot chick, this incredibly beautiful woman. The face that launched 1,000 ships is kind of what she gets called later on in the tradition. Helen of Troy, she's sometimes called. But Helen was originally married to Menelaus, who was the king of Sparta. And this is back before Greece is kind of a unified collection of city-states. It's more of a sort of series of tribes, of political and warlike tribes, sometimes called the Achaeans in the poem. Menelaus is married to Helen. Helen meets Paris. Paris is a Trojan prince. So he's out in Asia Minor, which, as we said, is Turkey, right? That's where Troy is in this ancient story. Paris, also very attractive, very good with the ladies, meets Helen and either steals her away or convinces her to come with. Nobody quite knows, and that's like a big point of gossip in antiquity as well, right? Who knows whether Helen wanted to go with Paris or whether she was stolen? I'm not quite sure. Anyway, Helen is gone. Helen ain't there anymore. This obviously does not make Menelaus particularly happy. He becomes, in fact, enraged to the point of wishing to marshal an enormous pan-Hellenic army, this group of all these different Achaean tribes, to sail across the sea and come to Troy and marshal the whole force of Greece against the Trojans for this lost woman. And his Menelaus' brother Agamemnon is kind of the leader of these armies. So you've got Menelaus and Agamemnon, and then you've got their best fighter, Achilles. And Achilles is semi-divine. He's the son of Thetis, who's a nymph, a water goddess. And he's he's like, LeBron and Peyton Manning and Mahershala Ali and I don't know, Muhammad Ali, all rolled up into one, right? He's this vastly powerful brute of a man, but also kind of sensitive, right? He's got a sensitive side. He sings, he plays music. And Achilles is just, the guy that the Greeks must have to win. He has been made it's kind of a promise, it's kind of a choice or a prophecy. He's been told that one of two things is going to happen to him in his life. Either he is going to live a long, healthy, and happy life in which he dies at a ripe old age and is never heard of again, never remembered, right? Just a glorious life on this earth, or rather not a glorious, but a happy life on this earth, and then off he goes. Alternatively, he can fight in the Trojan War with Menelaus and Agamemnon and all the rest of the Achaeans. And he can die young, and he can have glory forever. And it's kind of obvious which one he picks, because the Iliad is the fulfillment of that prophecy, right? The Iliad is the glory that Achilles gets for fighting in the Trojan War forever. And that's kind of the premise. That's really sort of where we begin the Iliad. We begin with this terrible slight that's made against Achilles by Agamemnon. Now, Achilles, as part of the spoils of war, he has won this kind of the concubine, basically, named Briseis. And for very complex reasons, Briseis needs to be taken away from Achilles and given to Agamemnon as part of this kind of political negotiation, let's say, between Agamemnon and a Trojan priest. Not hugely important. The loss of Briseis and the theft of a war prize from a war hero is not a small thing. People kind of get down on Achilles as if he just spends the whole poem like pouting against this tiny insult. But that's not what's going on here at all, right? Achilles has traded his life for glory. The Greeks called it kleos, the opportunity to be sung about and to be told, to have your deeds told of from generation to generation, right? That's what Achilles has bought with his life. And to be insulted by Agamemnon is basically to have that taken away too. So now he's going to die and he's going to be insulted. And so he quits. He basically just doesn't fight in the war. And that's where the poem begins, is that he's so furious that he leaves the Greeks basically to die at the hands of the Trojans. And the Trojans are no slouches, right? That's the other thing to remember, is that they're not this kind of like little burg out in the east. They are a huge and glorious civilization, in some ways more centralized, more civilized at this point than the Greeks. And they're led by this kind of golden boy, by Hector, who's not divine. But if the poem has a character that's just unequivocally sort of lovable and admirable, it's Hector. And Hector is kind of the leader of the Trojans who knows in some sense that he's fighting a doomed battle as soon as Achilles gets back in the fight. But once Achilles is out, the Trojans just start making hay. And that's kind of the premise of this poem. And then we have this massive and fantastic war story. Before we get into that, let me just note, I'm not going to talk a ton about the gore in this poem, but let me just commend to you an infographic called Death in the Iliad. This is GreekMythComics.com. If you Google this, it went viral a while back, so you may have seen it. But this will give you a sense of just sort of how brutal the fighting is in this poem and how devastating the deaths are. I'll just read from you a piece from this infographic, the top 3 grimmest deaths. The first prize goes to Erymas, a Trojan, who gets a spear in the mouth. And this is what Homer says about Erymas' death. The metal point of the spear penetrated under his brain and smashed the white jawbones. His teeth were knocked out, both his eyes filled with blood, and gasping for breath, he blew blood through both his mouth and nostrils. Well, there's your introduction to the Iliad. Congratulations. And there's tons of that. So that's kind of in and of itself enough of a recommendation to read the Iliad. But I'm going to read for you now the first few lines, that introduces this story of the rage of Achilles. The translation I'm reading from is by Robert Fagles. It came out in 1990. And for my money, it's still the best modern English translation of the Greek. So here's how Fagles renders the first 5 lines of the Iliad. Rage. Goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feasts for the dogs and birds. This is a pretty good entry, pretty good opening, right? Pretty good start to a poem. The next thing that I'm going to do, just so that we can experience this poem a little more deeply maybe than we usually do, is I'm going to read those same lines, those same first 5 lines in Greek, in ancient Greek. This is the language in which these poems would have originally been performed. And I have this awesome, I really love these old Parnassus. They're out of print now, I think, but this Parnassus library editions of these Greek texts. So that's what I have brought for this first podcast. And here's the first 5 lines, those same first 5 lines about the rage of Achilles in Greek. Men in aedethea peleiajo Achilleas, ulamanen, he myriachaios alge etheka, pollas difthimus psychas aidi proiapsin, heroon autuste heloria tauche kunessen, oio noisite passi. There's the first 5 lines in Greek. I have to confess that it gives me chills, and I know that makes me a nerd. It gives me chills. Here's the thing to pay attention to, though, about those first 5 lines, right? They're music. We always read these poems as text, but these are songs, right? This is a tradition of oral poetry and song. And they would have been probably accompanied with some form of instrumentation. But the thing about Greek meter, right, the way that the Greek meter works in poetry. So in English poetry, we have this thing called meter where you have a pattern of stress, right? If music be the food of love, play on. I emphasize certain words more than others. It little profits that an idle king by this still hearth among these barren crowds, right? This pattern of emphases. Greek poetry works a little bit differently because the long syllables, the syllables that you would emphasize in English, are actually long. That is, they're held for longer periods of time. So really what it is it's rhythm. It's musical rhythm. So Greek poetry is incredibly musical, and that's kind of why you hear these lines. It's not just meninae thea, it's meninae thea peleia jo achilleos. And it's called dactylic hexameter, this epic meter that Homer composed in. It's kind of, I think of it as hoofbeats and heartbeats, right? Da, 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 da. And the effect of this poem is very, very different from what you would expect from, say, a sort of short lyric English poem where you're kind of minutely scrutinizing each individual word and trying to draw out all these multiple meanings. C.S. Lewis, the great Christian apologist, pointed this out about the Iliad, that's not really the most sublime art of Homer. Homer is meant to kind of wash over you and just build phrase upon phrase. And many of the great epicists who followed Homer, Dante and Virgil and Milton, do similar things with their poetry, where you just kind of construct this vast world, and it gallops on with those hoofbeats, right? Obviously, without learning ancient Greek, you can't get that effect fully, but good translations like the Fales will try to deliver some English version of that, and it's worth paying attention to that as the kind of the chief charm of the poetry, I think. Just remember that they're music. That's all. I'm going to read another passage now from a different translation, because it's also kind of fun to see how different English poets over the years have taken this poem and made it into something English. This is from another famous passage. This is book 6. I mentioned Hector earlier, right? Hector is the sort of golden boy hero of the Trojans. And Hector knows on some level that he's fighting a losing fight, right? And his loved ones know this too. And he has a wife, Andromache, and a son, Astyanax. And in book 6 of the Iliad, Hector goes back into the walls of the city, and we get a kind of view inside Troy, what Troy's civilization is like. And one of the most famous scenes, probably in all of Western literature, happens there on the walls of Troy between Hector and his wife, Andromache. And Andromache basically says, look, if you go out there and if you fight Achilles, you're going to die. And I'm going to become a slave, and my son is going to get killed. Our son is going to get killed. This is not like something that the poem takes lightly, right? It's silly to imagine that this is a poem that thinks of the effects of war as just uniformly glorious, that just wholly valorizes war, right? Homer, the Iliad knows, that Homer knows what suffering is and what the suffering of war is. And he's so aware of it that it's kind of everywhere in this poem. It's the backdrop to everything that happens between Hector and Andromache, that the fate which awaits her is absolutely horrendous. And here's Hector's response to Andromache. He says, and this is Alexander Pope's translation from 1720, so an older translation, but one that people have sort of thought of as one of the best. Book 6, starting at line 441. That post, says Hector, shall be my care, not that alone, but all the works of war. How would the sons of Troy, in arms renowned, and Troy's proud dames, whose garments sweep the ground, attaint the luster of my former name, should Hector basely quit the field of fame? My early youth was bred to martial pains. My soul impels me to the embattled plains. Let me be foremost to defend the throne and guard my father's glories and my own. Yet come it will, the day decreed by fates. How my heart trembles while my tongue relates. The day when thou, he's talking, remember, to Andromache here, when thou, or rather, he's talking to Troy, imperial Troy must bend and see thy warriors fall, thy glory's end. And yet no dire presage so wounds my mind, my mother's death, the ruin of my kind, not Priam's hoary hairs defiled with gore, not all my brothers gasping on the shore, as thine, Andromache. Thy griefs I dread. I see thee trembling, weeping, captive led. In Argive looms our battles to design, and woes of which so large a part was thine. To bear the victor's hard commands, or bring the weight of waters from Hyperia's spring. There, while you groan beneath the load of life, they cry, behold, the mighty Hector's wife, some haughty Greek who lives thy tears to see, embitters all thy woes by naming me. The thoughts of glory past and present shame, 1,000 griefs shall waken at the name. May I lie cold before that dreadful day, pressed with a load of monumental clay. Thy Hector, wrapped in everlasting sleep, shall neither hear thee sigh nor see thee weep. That translation, the first thing to note about it, besides the fact that it's incredibly beautiful, is that it renders this dactylic hexameter, which I mentioned, into English iambic pentameter, rhyming couplets of iambic pentameter. And that's kind of the English epic meter, da 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 da, right? Iambic pentameter, 5 iambs per line, da 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 da. And that's kind of a way that Pope tries to get that experience of Homeric dactylic hexameter into English. But that's not really the important thing here, obviously, right? I mean, just the sentiment, the kind of high mixture of grief and sorrow and nobility that's expressed. Remember, in The Enemy of the Greeks, right? This is a Greek poem with tremendous sympathy for this basically doomed civilization, and it just localizes. This is one of the most magnificent things about Homer, is he's able to dramatize these huge themes in these tiny personal relationships, right? Husband, wife, son, and they're here together, acknowledging that even though death is imminent, the only choice is nobility. The only way is to stand up and fight. And at the end, spoiler alert, I guess, at the end, Hector does end up running from Achilles in their battle. But just the fact that he goes up against Achilles is kind of in itself an act of incomparable heroism. So there's great tragedy in this poem, as well as an amazing kind of celebration of just manly nobility and courage and womanly grace. That's about the end of our time. We're sort of running to the end of this first episode. So I think we'll just leave it there. We'll leave it with Hector and Andromache and Astyanax on the wall. If you haven't experienced these poems before and you want to read them, I do recommend that Fagel's translation. I also recommend learning Greek and reading them in the original, but that's obviously not for everybody. And so, yeah, if you want them in English, I think those Fagel's translations are really fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me for this first episode. It's been a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to doing this every week, and we'll come back next week. Be sure to subscribe if you want to receive new episodes. If you're on iTunes, if that's where you get your podcasts, then please do leave us a 5-star review. If you want to leave us a review that is anything other than 5-star, then keep it to yourself. Thank you very much. No, but do subscribe, do sign up. It would be great to have you with me on this journey. Before I sign off, I want to give sincere and heartfelt thanks to a couple people for making this first episode and this show in general come together. Jonathan Hay has been unbelievably generous with his time and helpful with his expertise as the advisor for this podcast, getting all the tech set up. This would not look or sound the way that it does if it were not for him. I can assure you of that, because I am technologically incompetent to the nth degree. So thank you, Jonathan, for helping with that. Thank you to Jake Gannon also, who has gone way above and beyond the call of duty. He works with me at the Claremont Institute, and he's the producer of this show. And like I said, this is kind of a side project. This is a bit of a passion project. So I really appreciate Jake being involved in it. I also really appreciate the support of the Claremont Institute, who have been so generous to me in helping to underwrite this podcast, in helping just to support me in all my various kooky projects and ambitions. When I came to them and said, I'm going to do a podcast about the Western canon. They did not say, well, that'll never work. So that's kind of cool. So yeah, if you like this content, if you think that this is interesting, you may well also like Claremont's official content. So I do highly advise going over to AmericanMind.org, ClaremontReviewBooks.com. I write a lot of stuff for them, but also a lot of other people who are way cooler than me write a lot of stuff for them, and we are basically a foundation for the study of the American ideal. So if you are interested in that, head on over. Thank you so much for joining me. That is the end of episode 1 of Young Heretics. We will see you all next week.